All right, so it's Friday, the day after 4th of July. Should be a good day to play some poker. I know a lot of people have it off work, so the question is, where are we gonna go? That's kind of the question I've been struggling with ever since San Manuel closed. The bike, the gardens, Lake Elsinore, somewhere else. Who knows where we're gonna end up? Let's just see. Hey guys, welcome back. As you saw, we ended up at Morongo Casino out in Cabazon, California, and pretty much as expected, it was a full house, a bunch of people there to play some cards, and not a lot of open seats, but luckily, we got sat right away at a brand new 1-3 no limit game. Without wasting any time, let's just jump straight into some hands because there's quite a few to go over this video. So pretty early on, we looked down at pocket twos from under the gun. I have somewhat mixed feelings about these small pairs from early position. I think in tough games where there's a lot of aggressive, good opponents, they should just be folds from these spots like under the gun and under the gun one. But given that my table was fairly passive and there's just not a lot of aggression at newly formed cash games, I decided to open it up and see if we could get to a flop. So I make it $10 to go. The late position player calls, the small blind and big blind also call. So 4 ways to a flop here, which right away we get some good news in Jack, 3, Deuce, Rainbow. The small blind checks, and surprisingly the big blind leads out for $30. Given the pot size and the texture of the board, this is actually a pretty strong looking bet, so I decided to just call and hopefully keep the other players in there if they have any piece of it. Both of them fold, so heads up to a turn, which is the ace of diamonds. This time the small blind checks it over to me, and I think you could go either way here. Not sure if we're getting called by worse twice on this turn card, so I decide to check it back, get a little deceptive with it, and hopefully get a big bet in on the river for value, or raise if he decides to do the stop and go play. Anyway, heads up to a river, which doesn't change much in the 8 of diamonds. He checks it over again, and pretty certain that we have the best hand now. It's just a matter of how much to bet. I decide to make a bet of $70. He thinks about it for a really long time and eventually puts in the call. Being that he took this long and we're not getting raised, we can be fairly certain that we're good. Sure enough, I show the pocket twos and we scoop the first hand of the day. So this time, small pair from early position works out. A few hands later, the straddle is on and I look down at pocket nines from under the gun. Make a standard open to $20, folds all the way to the straddle who makes the call. So heads up to a flop here, which comes Jack, 6, 3, Rainbow. The straddle checks it over to us, and although we're obviously losing to a Jack, I think this is a good spot to put in a bet because we could still deny equity from hands like Ace 10 and King Queen, other Broadway combinations, and also maybe possibly charge other pairs that we're ahead of. So I put in a bet of $20 just for equity protection, and he puts in the call. The turn's not the best card in the King of Hearts, bringing the second heart on board. And a little bit weird is that he leads out for $60 on this card. Not really sure what he's representing, but I don't really feel like getting into such a marginal spot, and maybe he's just playing it weird, but it just feels like we're behind. So I decided to put in the fold and wait for a better spot later on. All right, so the next few hands, I actually recorded them a little bit differently than I normally do. I just set my phone down on the table and got the entire hand on video. So I'm gonna switch over to a voiceover so you guys can get a more in-depth view of how it looks at the table when I'm playing. Hopefully you guys enjoy this approach, and I'll get back to you after we're done with those hands. All right, in this next hand, there's a few limpers, and then a middle position player decides to raise it up to $6. Which is just a min raise. When the action gets back to us in late position and I look down at pocket sevens, I think you could go one of two ways here. Putting in a raise and isolating the min raiser doesn't seem terrible, but calling also seems fine in position and just navigating post flop. This time I decide to put in the call, The big blind calls and the two limpers put in the extra $3. So we're going multi-way to a flop here, which is definitely on the better side of flops. It's 10-7-5 with 2 diamonds. It checks to the original raiser. He puts out a continuation bet of $20. So normally heads up, I would lean towards calling here in position, but there's 2 issues with that in this exact situation. Number 1 is going to be that flatting gives a really good price to anyone behind us to continue with a straight or flush draw, which is not what we want. And secondly, our opponent in this case should be more weighted towards value hands, because putting in a c-bet into multiple opponents is typically a sign of strength, whereas if he was putting in a c-bet heads up or maybe even 3 ways, it could still be a lot of bluffs that are just trying to take down the pot. So having these 2 factors considered, I think the best play here is actually to put in a raise and try to build a pot, seeing as we both started the hand with around $400. So I make it $65. It folds back to him and he pretty quickly folds. Just goes to show he was actually putting in a c-bet that he probably shouldn't be, and unfortunately we don't get much action with a set this time. In this next hand, we look down at Jack 9 of spades from late position, decide to open it up to $12 and get called by just a small and big blind. So we're going to go 3 ways to a flop in position, which comes down 10-10-4 with 2 clubs. They both check it over to me, and we don't really have much of anything, but the board is fairly dry, so I think a c-bet can take it down a lot of the time. No need to go too large here, so I make it $10. The small blind calls and the big blind calls as well. So after we get called in 2 spots, I'm pretty much done with the hand unless we turn a pair or something. The turn is a 7 of clubs, and after they check it over to me once again, I just don't think this is a good card to continue on. There's not a lot of holdings that should be calling the flop and then folding to a turn bet on this exact card. So I'm pretty much done with the hand at this point, decided to just check it back, and we're still 3 ways to a river, which is the Jack of diamonds, giving us top pair on the board. And once again, they check it over to me. I think it's a good spot to go for some thin value, especially considering that the small blind is probably one of the more curious opponents on the table. Doesn't seem to like folding too much. So I put out a bet of $30, hoping to get called by smaller pocket pairs or maybe a 7 and potentially even ace high. So after a little bit of deliberation, the small blind does call and the big blind gets out of the way. We turn over our hand and he throws his in the muck. So a hand that looked like it was pretty much going nowhere ended up going pretty nicely here. In the next hand, there's 3 limpers and I look down at ace queen offsuit from the big blind. I decide to make it $20 to go. 2 of the limpers call and the 3rd limper gets out of the way. So we're going 3 ways out of position to a flop of 7-3-3 with 2 clubs. It's similar to the last board, but this time with ace high, we have decent showdown value and we're also out of position. So I decide to check and see what develops, and both my opponents check. Still 3 ways to a turn here, which is a great card in the queen of clubs. Although it completes the front door flush, I'm not too worried about it, given that I think our opponents should be betting flush draws on the flop after the initial raiser checks, which in this case was us. So I think it's a good spot to put out a bet for value. I make it $25. The first limper calls and the other player gets out of the way. I think most of his calling range here is going to consist of flush draws, possibly even some weaker holdings like a very optimistic straight draw. When the river comes a 10 of spades, I don't think this is going to improve our opponent too often, and although we could bet for value here, perhaps from a worse queen or a non-believing pocket pair, I think there's more value in checking and inducing a bluff from all his missed draws. So that's what I decided to do this time, check it over to him, and he pretty quickly puts out a bet of $30. I happily make the call, and surprisingly, he shows 6-5 of clubs for a flush.
What the fuck?
I think this holding in particular should be betting the flop the majority of the time, but as played, it worked out for him and we lose this hand. At this point, we get no playable cards for quite a while, but finally, after around 2 weeks, we look down at pocket tens from middle position. My nipples tingle slightly at the sight of a beautiful hand, and I decide to open to $15. The player on our direct left calls, and the big blind calls as well. So 3 ways to a flop, which comes king 10-6 with 2 diamonds. My nipples are fully engaged at this point, and when the big blind checks, I decide to put in a bet of $20. The player on my left calls, and the big blind folds. So heads up to a turn, which is the 7 of hearts, a great card. It doesn't change much, and if our opponent has a flush draw or top pair, he should still be continuing to a bet here. So I make it $65. He thinks for a really long time actually, and sadly folds. However, after such a long time of getting no playable cards, it still feels good to just take down a pot. Wish there could have been a little more action, but still happy it went our way. On to the next hand.
Trust me, I broke it down. I'm looking at your stack. I'm saying it's 200. He's betting like over 65, so you are committed and you will call. So.
There's a regular at the Morongo poker room who is well known for his table talk and psychological warfare, if you will. He's really fun to play against because he engages a lot of his opponents and isn't just quiet like most players you encounter at a poker table. This next hand is by far the most interesting from the session because he's our main villain, and it also just develops in a really weird way. There's 2 limps and he makes it $6, again a min raise. I never said he was the strongest player, but he's definitely entertaining and can be really tricky. I'm next to act with pocket jacks, and I decide to put in a 3-bet to $30. It folds back to him, and he pretty quickly puts in the call. So we're going to go heads up in position to a flop of ace-6-4 with 2 hearts. He checks blind, which just means he checks before the flop comes out. And when the action's on us, even though there's an overcard to our jack, I think it's a good spot to put in a bet because this guy is super sticky, doesn't like to fold, and there's still a lot of cards that we could charge for value, such as 7-5 or 5-3 are open-ended straight draws. There's flush draws, and I also just don't think this player will fold a pair to 1 bet. So I put in a bet of $20, and he doesn't think for too long and makes the call. The turn is the queen of diamonds, and once again he checks without looking at the turn first. I think at this point, with another overcard to the jacks, it's best to just check back and control the pot. He could easily have gotten ahead with a queen X of hearts type of hand, or might still be ahead with an ace. So I check it back, and we go heads up to the river, and this is where the hand gets pretty interesting. He covers his eyes and puts out a bet of $75. As he's placing this bet, the river peels off the 3 of spades, and that cues my long indecisive period where I'm just not sure what to do in the hand. After about a minute, the situation is pretty funny because he still hasn't looked at the river, but at this point he does check his whole cards again. I jokingly lean over and ask him to show me one, to which he says he can't. So seeing as I have pretty much nothing to lose, I show him the jack of diamonds just to see if that triggers any kind of information I could get.
Is this any good?
Oh my gosh. That is fucking... I guess I can show you one more.
And surprisingly, he turns over a card for me and shows me the 7 of clubs. If he had showed me a heart, I think I would just call right away, but after seeing the 7 of clubs, I think about it for a little bit longer and decide that if he's deciding to call a 3-bet with ace-7 out of position, more power to him, but I'm feeling like a hero call is in order here, especially against this exact player type, so...
Alright, I call.
Good call. Good call.
No, he's got 3. Oh.
Good jack. Nice call.
And he says, good call, turns over 7-6 of clubs. So it's nice that the table talk finally went our way, given that in the past, I'm sure you guys have watched the previous vlogs, I'm pretty awful with those kind of spots. I usually end up making the wrong decision when opponents are giving me information. So always nice to make a correct call in a somewhat tough spot like that one. Decided to rack up a little bit after that, end things on a good note, and call it a session. I know you guys missed my blonde hair, so I'll send you back to my full screen version right now. Alright, so when it's all said and done, got into the game for $300 and out for $412. Obviously not the biggest win ever, but my main concern is always just making the best decisions, and this session in particular, I was actually pretty happy with how I played. Moving on, I wanted to give a quick announcement before wrapping up the video. I'll be in Las Vegas this Tuesday through Friday, I think that's July 9th through 12th, just grinding cash games around the city. So if any of you guys are in town, shoot me a message on Instagram. The link is in the description if you want to play a session or grab a beer or whatever. As always, thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It really helps the channel grow. Anyway, that's a wrap. Good luck out there. See you guys next time. Peace.